Thanks for a very interesting and informative talk. Really just a very straightforward question. Just to get the position clearer. So you started out outlining, if I heard you right, these two sort of standard ways of reading the academic position. There's the sort of, you didn't mention the name, but the Charlotte Stow approach, where you sort of read this as a position that allows a tentative type of belief and puts a lot of weight on the Carneadian story and sees this as a way of arriving at sort of tentative, corrigible belief, and that's the best you can have on their account. And then there's the Croissant and Berniat reading, which is says, no, that's all a mistake. You know, you've got them having a theory of impressions and so on. No, that's all language they took over from the Stoics and are merely adopting in order to construct a counter-argument. And so the Carneadian story is really a story not about what Carneades himself thinks we ought to do in order to hold beliefs and get through life. It's a story about how, starting from Stoic premises, you can arrive at anti-Stoic conclusions and thereby undermine the Stoic position. So is that right, roughly?
Yeah, those were the two views I was thinking of. I didn't want to get too bogged down in secondary views, but yes, certainly. And I mean, there is a lot, if you look at the text, there's a lot of evidence supporting both instances. I mean, so for instance, Cousin, he looks at the language used in quite a few of the sources, and I think he points out that they deliberately use Stoic vocabulary, for instance, in a lot of their arguments, and he seems to think that this isn't something that could be contingent, that this is quite deliberately done. And on the other hand, for those supporting some sort of weak belief interpretation, if you look primarily at Cicero, for instance, he does use words for belief, particularly with Carneades. He talks about the kind of belief that Carneades supported. So I mean, there definitely is evidence for both of those views as well.
So the latter reading, as you said, would be compatible with them having something like the Pyrrhonian renunciation of belief across the board.
Yeah, that's what Cousin seems to go for.
Clytomachus, of course, actually says that explicitly about his predecessors.
But of course, he had an interest in saying that because that was his view at the time.
Yeah. I mean, but that's some of the evidence one would appeal to justify this. But no, my question then is really very simple one. It's just, so you talked about developing an intermediate position. And said that part of that position was that there's no need for belief in order to act, and no need to have belief on the academic view. And now I'm just wondering how that's supposed to differ from the latter of the two standard views, as you described.
What, from the Cousin view?
Right.
Okay, so the main difference there, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, this is all very difficult stuff to kind of talk about without writing a massive paper, making many nuanced references to texts and language and things like this. But from what I understand, that view is essentially, he's trying to argue that they have absolutely no view whatsoever. So all they're doing is coming up with counter-arguments, not only to the Stoics, but also there's evidence for some Epicurean counter-arguments as well, in which case they have absolutely no view. They're entirely apparetic, and all they're doing is running around and giving people counter-arguments and snickering. And while that's an interesting reading, and he does a fabulous job of looking at the texts and things like this, and it's entirely plausible, I thought it might be more fun to look at it in a slightly different way.
Sorry, I do have to follow up on that. No, my question is just...
How is mine different?
How does this differ?
Okay, so the way this is different then is that, and yeah, by the way, I'm an incredible insomniac at the moment, so if I'm not making any sense, just kind of keep at me. So my view is essentially that they do have a positive view insofar as I think that they think that we can have a certain amount of practical and problematic, knowledge isn't the right word, but certain practical and problematic access to the world. And they do have a positive view insofar as this is the case. So, for instance, in a number of the Sextus quotes, there is a certain amount of talk of going along with nature and things like this. And there's there are certain kind of words insinuating nature and order and certain amount of access to this and going along with it. And I mean, I know Cousin thinks that this is deliberate Stoic terminology, but I think that it is hinting at a more positive view. Although it's a very deflationary positive view, where they are putting something forward that is slightly positive. So
something like, if I try to reword it in my own terms, it would be something like, it's more than Pyrrhonist appearances.
Certainly.
But it's less than belief.
Yeah. I think they're kind of trying to argue for some really odd intermediary there. Because I think they do talk, like if you look at the Sextus quotes at least, there's discussion of the fact that that there is truth and falsity, but it's something we don't have access to. And so it's almost, I don't want to say that they're fallibilists, because they are. They think like any knowledge claims we have are fallible, but it's more than that. I think what they're saying is that just, particularly when it comes to the discussion of action, just most of our actions are just completely unproblematic and pre-rational and things that we don't think about to the point where we need to have assent or belief about them. We just do most of the things that we do. And I think that's kind of a really interesting point. And there are a few, like I went through this quite quickly, but there are a few passages in the handout more to that effect if you look at some of the language they actually use. And I find that quite interesting, if that helps. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a few questions precisely about the language and all of this,
Okay.
because it's really hard to really figure out what's going on there.
Yeah.
You know, we tend to say things like, believe, but then it's not easy to say whether any of the people involved in that discussion thought that we even had propositional attitudes. I mean, of course, it's sometimes said that the Stoics have a concept of a proposition, the lekton, but then that is certainly not our concept of a proposition. And if you look at this, the translations are fairly problematic. And here, there's a specific passage which either is utterly confused here in Sextus, by Sextus himself, or something else.
Sextus is notoriously kind of confused.
Well, I'm not that sure. I think the translations are notoriously confused. But, because
the translations could be better in some instances.
Yeah, well, I mean, here, so I'm wondering how you make sense of this. In this longest Sextus quote in 4, because assent, synkatathesis. You don't have your hand out? Okay. Yeah.
And so you're looking at...
So assent, which seems to be a psychological concept if you look at it.
Yeah,
I think assent,
it is entirely...
assent in the
this
Stoics...
This is a very internalist theory.
Exactly, yeah. So no, let me go on. So assent seems to be a psychological category, right? A synkatathesis means, what is the syn? Well, it's an attitude that is going with a fantasia.
Yeah.
And a fantasia is not a proposition. So a synkatathesis, like translating it as assent, well, that might make it already look like a proposition. But okay, so here I'm just worrying, what to do with it. But because assent occurs not in relation to an impression, but in relation to language. So Sextus tries to pull the concept of synkatathesis onto some kind of propositional ground.
Well, this is supposed to be our Arcesilaus.
Yeah. Well, so they are doing
Sextus is our Arcesilaus, anyways. Yeah.
And, language is logos here, of course,
Yeah.
so that's, as a translation, very problematic, because then it says for assent belongs to propositions, lecta. So that is problematic as a translation. And then this really apparently very confused claim, secondly, because no true impression is found to be of a kind such that it couldn't turn out false. Well, I would say this is analytically false. What's here, no, every true impression is found to be of such a kind that it could not turn out false.
Yeah,
that's what it means for it to be true. So either this would be, there are some, sometimes skepticism is based on a very, very misguided reading of what it is to be a fallibilist. And I'm wondering whether this is really going on here. If I look at it, in the translation, the two sentences that I read are so confused that it's, I'm looking for more charitable reading of how first the Stoics, of what's going on in the Stoics, and how the academics pull this on a different ground by making some kind of case to the effect that the psychological category of a synkatathesis is really profoundly propositional, and that this creates some worries. Because what they're trying to do, of course, is they're trying to move, I would think that the Stoic concept of the Cataleptic fantasia is a kind of externalism. So, and it's an externalism within...
they are painting it in those terms, certainly.
And in the categories of the philosophy of mind. And of course, in order for Sextus to get anywhere, he needs to re-embed the concept and make it look as if it was a theoretical concept. They are saying, well, look, here's a psychological state that people are supposed to have, and this is where the action is for the Stoics. And in order to move it away from there seem to be some odd moves here. So I'm wondering, how you would reconstruct really the details of what you count here as, step 8.
So there's an awful lot to break down in that comment, but could you go back to the truth comment you made?
Well, if you look at no true impression is found to be of such a kind that it could not turn out false.
So
then it's not true. It's analytically false.
In that instance, it isn't actually analytically false if you look at the fact that what they are terming the true and the false is the thing that is making the impression. So they talk about it like this. There's the thing that's making the impression and the thing that is being impressed upon. So the human is the thing that's being impressed upon. And this is their very basic notion of perception. I think it's actually a bit more complicated than that because it seems that there's an awful lot going on the internal side of it and what happens to the person when they're being impressed upon. But the truth and falsity only exists on the side of the thing doing the impressing. And on the side of the thing that's impressed upon, the human, there's only apparent truths and apparent falsities. So you have to be really careful with how they're using their language because they're doing a lot of wordplay that can be very confusing in that instance. So in that instance, you can run into instances where something appears to you to be false, but it is in fact true.
Well,
does that make sense?
No, what I'm getting at is I don't even think that Sextus is talking about true and false. Like pseudos can also mean in this particular context, I think, misleading. So if you translate it this way, then I think this gets you into all sorts of troubles. I think the argument is quite different from the way it reads here. I think the point has something of the following form. So even if you have a cataleptic fantasia, and it's true, okay, your relation to that fantasia, so Sextus thinks and that the academics think that there's an additional layer. So even though you might have this, you might be misled by adding another attitude to that psychological state that you're in, and this is where the worry comes in.
So you're saying
so even a true proposition,
the worry is the assent, is where they're trying to undermine the Stoic position, certainly. But I mean, like there does seem to be textual evidence to the fact that the Stoics did seem to think that it was a threefold, that at least with action or with simple perception, if you take action out of it, that it was some sort of twofold thing. I mean, you certainly can come up with more charitable readings of the Stoics, and I wasn't so much focusing on that because I was more interested in the academic skeptics. But even still, at some point, you have to, for their notions of wisdom and right action to work, the Stoic sage has to be in an incredible amount of control of themselves and all of the reactions to their environment that they have and the decisions they make, even on a very small scale. And if you're thinking about it in terms of the sage, I think that the academic skeptics possibly have some room to drive a wedge in there, because even though you might be able to start looking at the Stoics in terms of like the sage having a capacity to view the world in a certain way, in which case there will be a certain amount of habitual action based on that capacity or something like this, you could do something like that. At some point, if you were being sneaky as an academic skeptic, you have room to drive a wedge in there, possibly.
All right, thanks, Abby. I think I just have a really simple question of clarification.
Yeah, no, for sure. Sorry, it's a little confused, but I'm trying.
No.
It's difficult to do these talks for a general audience because normally you would have Greek texts and English texts or whatever translations and do things like what Marcus was doing, but it's a bit boring if it's not your area.
Well, I did hear some interesting points of overlap, I think, with Rachel's talk this morning. So I'm going to use some terminology that she invoked. So you're saying that this Stoic quest for certainty, it has a constitutive aim, and that aim being tranquility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I don't know, this might be oversimplistic, but is your claim that the academic skeptics are more or less embracing this constitutive aim, but just saying that the Stoics are unable to attain it through this search for certainty?
I mean, that's possibly one way of looking at how, like, it's hard to say because, again, this isn't something that's directly stated in the evidence. It's something you might be able to infer. And I have some theories on this that aren't very careful, so I probably won't put them forward today. But there is some discussion at some points in the text. I believe in some of the Cicero texts, where they do start talking about the fact, I think it's typically the Carneades Cicero text, where he does talk about the fact that engaging in the world in this way will in fact lead to a better life, and he does seem to insinuate that you will be happier. I don't recollect seeing the word ataraxia in there, but it seems to be something that in the Cicero text that he's kind of pointing at that they were getting at. But I mean, it was something that was very much present in the tradition at the time. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was what they were getting at. But quite often, I think what I see, at least when I look at the texts, is that their main problem with this, well, they seem to have a couple of problems with the Stoics. So one of the problems is that this position doesn't seem to be descriptively accurate of the human experience. And so that's a big one. And secondly, I think they think that in addition to that, the knowledge claims being made by the Stoics are so outrageously high that it's almost entirely useless engaging in this enterprise. And actually, if you think about it, I don't know, this might be kind of a convoluted way of looking at it, but the Stoics, even though they think they have this positive dogmatic claim, end up having a knowledge claim that is so outrageously high that they themselves almost have a skeptic position, because even the Stoics agree that most people run around with opinion and don't have certainty or wisdom. And there are even some places where you can see that they think maybe Socrates was wise, maybe. And when you start having knowledge and certainty claims that are that outrageously high, what is the point in having them? And I think that that's a worthwhile claim about looking at our priorities in quest for knowledge. Like, at what point does this kind of obsession with truth and certainty and knowing for sure and universal knowledge and things like this just become completely counterproductive? Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. That's great. That helps.
Thank you. I'm a little bit puzzled by the Stoic claim that the cataleptic aphantasia is the criterion of truth, and at the same time they seem to maintain that the wise is a criterion of truth. Or is it the wise that has a cataleptic aphantasia? Is it both together? Is it that only a wise can have a cataleptic aphantasia? And what is it then that is a cataleptic aphantasia if only a wise man could have it?
Yeah.
So it doesn't really become clear to me.
Yeah.
And the second point would be, you seem to me, but maybe I didn't understand you correctly, you seem to me to say that the synkatathesis is in a way related to reflection. But then I would wonder, what about any perception? For the Stoics, they famously identified perception with synkatathesis. Mm-hmm. So is it that we reflect on any perception the same way than we have it? So I would probably not take it too strong, that claim. And maybe just to Marcus Gabriel, I'm not sure if I have the right passage here, but they seem to have translated cataleptic aphantasia as true. fantasia, simply.
Yeah, but for the Stoics it would be truth, so they're interchangeable.
This is what they famously claim, that
translation is no cataleptic fantasia is found to be such that it could not be misleading. Now that's a completely...
And that it says that it could not be a not cataleptic fantasia. This is exactly what the skeptics claim, and then it makes more sense.
Because this is just
So first of all, going back to your, what was your first question again? Pardon me? It was, right, the criterion and wisdom. Okay, yeah. So, first of all, I want to point out here that I'm not discussing Stoicism. I don't really, for the purposes of this paper, I don't really care about Stoicism as such. I care about what the academic skeptics thought Stoics were doing. So regardless of whether or not the Stoics were actually doing something interesting and defensible, which they probably were in some ways. I'm sure there are nice ways to do wonderful little readings of Stoicism. The academic skeptics weren't interested in that. And while it might be interesting to have a discussion of their actual historical interaction, I'm more interested in looking at what the academic skeptics were getting at with their arguments, regardless of whether or not they were setting up a straw man, which was fairly notoriously done at the time. However, I will answer your first question, which was, according to a number of texts at least, the cataleptic impression is the criterion for truth. So something can only be true when it's cataleptic. However, you can have access to a cataleptic impression when you're not wise, when you only have opinion. And it's because people who have opinion have access to truth. They also have access to falsity, which means that their opinion is contingent. Whereas a Stoic sage has access to wisdom, and because of however you would like to read the Stoics and how they cash this out, this access to wisdom gives you a reliable access to knowledge, so you will only ever assent to cataleptic impressions when you're a sage and you're wise. So when you're wise, you always have cataleptic impressions, which are always true, so you're always in truth. Whereas cataleptic impressions, if you have access to them no matter what, means that you have a true instance there. Does that make sense?
Insofar as it can make sense. But the question, I think, is decisive if you want to make a decision about the claim, if the Stoics can, in fact, set out something against the skeptic attack.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't really what I was getting at with this talk at the moment. I'm sure that there is a really interesting dialogue that could be had by comparing the two texts historically. But just for the purpose of this, I just kind of wanted to look at the actual academic skeptics and see if they're maybe doing something a little more idiosyncratic than is sometimes commonly held.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have a question about the. So I think there is some kind of tension in what the skeptics say about how action works. I take the door example. So they say that we need, in cases of action, an impression of something appropriate and an impulse. So this is some kind of non-rational thing. So the idea would be the thing there appears to me as a door, in a sense, something like a Gibsonian affordance, or so that it's a non-reason mediated thing. So it just looks to me as a door, and I have the impulse to open the door to go out. So this talk of impulse suggests such a picture where reason plays no role, something like Dreyfus or Heidegger or Gibson. So where you have some kind of immediate coping with the environment. But then in the last quote they talk about reason they talk of action
you're talking about Arcesilaus using the criterion of reasonableness.
Yeah, and I think there's some tension. If that's true, that would seem to suggest, but then the door appears to me. It appears to me as a reason to use it to go outside of the room. So I think there's some tension there.
I mean that's a really interesting point, but unfortunately it relies on the fact that Arcesilaus' reasonableness criterion is being used in a technical term, and something being framed in that way doesn't mean it necessarily has to use reason, if that makes sense. So I mean, like, the Greeks were notoriously loose with a lot of their language. So when you're looking at the text, you have to ask yourself, is this word being used technically? So is it referring to something that's a faculty? Or is it referring to something like, in this case, I would argue, just being a state of being unproblematic? So it's reasonable in the sense that it doesn't strike me as being completely insane. So I see a door, I don't see a shark walking through the door or something like this. They like to talk a lot about like being insane and extreme perceptions and things like this.
Well then perhaps I was misled also by the translation. For instance, here there's talk of reasonable justification. This seems to be something stronger than that, but so perhaps again the translation caused some misunderstanding, or so it may be that.
Yeah, I was looking at that kind of in a non-technical way, but I mean it really depends on how you're looking at language use. I mean, there are lots of instances where words are being used technically, and there are lots of instances where they're not. So I was looking at the text and taking that in a non-technical way, because as well, if you look at a lot of their other arguments, it's massively inconsistent. You also have to take into account that the texts that are being presented there are also massively inconsistent, because there are maybe hundreds of years in between them being written, and they're being written by different people who have different interpretations of what's going on. So it also makes it more difficult to look at the language use. But yes.
Follow up on that, because I think it was a very interesting suggestion, and I don't know whether you meant it as a sort of novel thesis. As a novel thesis,
I'm used to reading.
But it's very interesting. I think you said, maybe it doesn't really emphasize the role of reason, but it's playing some sort of non-standard. It has some more non-standard reason. And then you said it means sort of not insane. Well, if you cash out, if I'm not reading too much into your comment, your idea would be, well, they talk a lot about the allogos, and what this is actually a kind of artificial antonym to the allogos. So rather than emphasizing rationality, it just means not crazy, or something like that. I mean, the reason I say this is interesting is because it is kind of a mystery what on earth Arcesilaus meant by eulogos.
It's completely...
There's no sort of amplification on this. There's no theory of action like in Carneades in the text. He may have intended that, but it's not in Cicero.
Certainly, and I mean, it's only in one passage. I mean, I'm reading a lot into it. I mean, if you really want to get into the history side of things, I mean, it would be very easy to come back to me and say, well, this is one tiny comment in a passage, and maybe Arcesilaus really didn't think that at all, and this is just somebody importing their terminology into his thought for their own purposes. I mean, that's very possible. I would actually feel historically more comfortable with it if something similar was popping up in another text. We certainly see you see this throughout the Greek tradition. I mean, you see it especially in Plato. I mean, this is something that's very difficult when you're reading Plato, for instance, that lots of people like to read him and pull out all of these technical terms. But if you actually look at the ambiguity with which he uses a lot of his language, it's very difficult to find technical terms in Plato. And I think that there's a tendency, because there are a lot of Attic Greek buzzwords that get thrown around in graduate philosophy courses or whatever, to try to see certain static similarities in language use throughout the tradition that aren't really the case, or not even just throughout the tradition, but throughout one person's thought, that in many cases aren't the case. But there certainly is technical use of words as well, but it's very contextually dependent.
But I think in a way making that very generic point undersells the interest of what you said, because you had a very specific counter-proposal about what this means.
Well, it certainly does work in this context because he is talking about the elogos and he is using examples of having extreme perceptual problems in cases. So, I mean, it does seem to be plausible in this case. But I do like to make the point that generally, like, I think people tend to overemphasize technical use of language in Attic Greek at times.
Thanks. Sorry to...
First, I wanted to attempt to salvage, who is it, Sedley, from the charge of giving a translation that expresses an inconsistent thought. I don't have the Greek, but the English that I read, at least, does not strike me as expressing an inconsistent statement. It says, I think the statement was, because no true impression is found to be of a kind such that it could not turn out false. Was that the sentence? It was claimed to be inconsistent. And the way in which I read it was, perhaps that's a projection on my part, was in this way. There's no impression such that its truth is guaranteed by its kind. Or in other words, there's no impression such that no true impression such that there couldn't be an impression that is of the same kind and yet turns out to be false. So that was how I read it. That's possible. But that would make sense, in line with that would fit with the progression, I think, of the argument as I read it. I mean, this just would entail that the assent could not find sufficient ground in the impression itself, because anyway, there's just a remark on the text. But I wanted to ask you, Abby, about this concept that you sought to introduce and by which you sought to distinguish yourself from both interpretations of academics that you began with. Mm-hmm. It was a concept which was supposed to be not weak belief, and yet some state of the mind. It's with that. I mean, you did characterize it as, if I understood you right, as that by reference to which something may be apprehended as problematic, or as out of the ordinary. That is, perhaps there shouldn't be a pun, but I mean, this would mean that it's actually an idea of order, by reference to which something may be not ordinary, not in order. And so I think it's quite. I mean, to characterize that as, I don't know whether the academics do this, but I mean, to describe this as a logos strikes me as off. I mean, if anything is logos, I would say then that's a consciousness of order, or that by reference to which something may be not ordinary. I mean, there's a distinction between the animal and the human being in this respect. The animal may be, as we're dumbfounded, by things that do not conform to how things in general go in its environment. But the idea of that which is ordinary is not, I suppose, itself an idea of the animal. While in the human being, as you described it, I mean, it's the idea of the water being somehow, something's wrong, and so this attests to a consciousness of what's ordinary as such, which I just for myself, would think of is the first thing I would want to call logos.
I mean, I suppose to a certain extent some of these things depend upon like how you want to think of belief and whatnot as well. So I mean, like you can create like incredibly weak notions of belief where like something that might function as a background assumption could be thought of in terms of belief. But I was thinking that in their terms that they might be getting at the point that in our quotidian lives we just become accustomed to things, and that there just isn't that kind of reflection about what we're accustomed to, and that doesn't require us to think of it in terms of there being an order that we have to understand to be able to be accustomed to those things. Does that make sense?
I mean, this was actually not a question about your interpretation of the academy, but rather of what I should want to make of it.
Yeah.
But so I was thinking that the kind of habit or formation of the mind which is manifest in my apprehending something as wrong would itself have to be described as
belief,
as logos, not as belief. I mean, let the words fall where they may. I mean, my interest is rather in how, in general, to think ultimately of that which distinguishes human beings from animals, and I take logos to be that a term for that, and so I would think I would call that logos then.
So that's really interesting. I mean, like that's an interesting point because, like, for instance, if you look at Anthony Long talks about this a little bit, where he mentions that, so for instance, your view would be something maybe along the lines of what the Stoics would think. They thought that in differentiating humans and animals just have this like base impulse and assent, and so they just react to their environments and they're not really reflective. And like you said, they maybe don't have the capacity to notice when something's out of order. It's just something they want to avoid or not avoid, that's it. This smells like food, this doesn't smell like food, what have you. But Anthony Long, I know, has written about how he thinks that it might be the case that the academic skeptics were deliberately playing with this and trying to create a more animalian style for the human cognition, and that they were deliberately playing on this in their responses to the Stoics. So what you're picking up on is possibly the case for them, but I think they might be trying to make the counterpoint that you don't really actually have to have logos to be able to interact with your environment like that. That maybe, at least, that maybe it's just generally more than we need. Which isn't to say, and this is just looking at basic action, which isn't to say that we're not capable of higher order thought or we wouldn't be able to have this conversation right now. But I think they're making a specific argument against general action, against the Stoics in that sense, if that works for you.
Last question.
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to pick up on just exactly this point that Sebastian raised. So what I had been wanting to ask about is, what is there in the academic view, as you understand it, to distinguish human beings from animals? So let me just press that. So let me just ask that, particularly in the light of what you've just said.
Well, the problem is there isn't anything unfortunately. They don't talk about animals as far as anything I've ever... Have you ever read them talk about animals, Michael?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is this...
I don't...
This classic paper discusses how they reworked the Stoic view that you need assent in addition to an impression for action in humans by taking their view about animals who can have engage in behaviour in place of just impressions.
Yeah.
And using that against them.
Yeah, I was just mentioning that.
So to that extent, there is discussion of animals.
Yeah. But that's implied, isn't it? They're not expressly discussing animals in any of the texts.
No, I think...
Because I don't remember seeing...
At least the way Freire reads it.
Okay. Because I know, at least from the fragments I read, that you definitely could read that, but I don't remember seeing any reference to animals. But perhaps I missed some. Yeah, this is what I mean, but the structure definitely is, I think it's a good point, that the structure is definitely there and is very likely deliberate in pointing out that we don't really need much more than the animal state of things.
So in a way, I'm not so... I mean, I am interested in what the academic skeptics actually thought, but I'm also interested in you're trying to come up with this interpretation that is sort of a middle ground between the two interpretations that you described initially. And it seems to be a feature of the first interpretation that there is something in that picture, belief in that picture, that you could appeal to distinguish human beings from animals, whereas it seems like on the other picture, there clearly doesn't seem to be anything. And you were kind of gesturing in your response to Michael at things that might distinguish, something that falls short of belief, but is still more than, presumably, whatever it is that animals have.
I don't think that they think that we're more than animals when it comes to action. Because I think, also, this is a very specific thing. They're not talking about theoretical reasoning or anything. They're not, as far as the texts I've seen go, as you can see, I'm no expert on the academic skeptics, though I find them incredibly interesting. They're not discussing theoretical reasoning. They're discussing practical action in a very specific context.
Yeah.
And I think that in those instances, they don't think that we're any better than animals, at least from what I can see, and they don't seem to find that problematic.
Okay.
And I know that's quite controversial, and a lot of people will find that problematic. I find it quite interesting, personally, because I'm also a massive animal rights activist, so I think that that's great. But, I mean, yeah, so I think...
But what does the origin quote 3, the origin quote 3 discusses exactly animals and rational animals?
You know, that's rational animals, I think, just referring to humans.
Yeah,
but
we have a quote here. So I'm wondering what this refers to.
I don't have, can I
what
have?
What is origin discussing? Because there you have it. So there's a distinction between, so there, so is this an account of what the, who is origin talking? Is this origin talking about?
That's a quote about the Stoics, by the way, not the academic skeptics. So they would believe in rational animals. As far as I've read, there aren't a ton of fragments. As far as I've read, there aren't any references to rational animals in academic skeptic theory. They might make... I haven't seen anything. They talk about the... like things being alogos and things like this, but not rational animals as far as I know.
But again, if Michael's reconstructing that argument, right, they are drawing.
No, but yeah, there's definitely heavy implication there, but no actual rational animals. Yes?
Make one footnote to what you said. I think the line of your answer behind this is the direction of it is a good one. And one might there compare the pyramids. I mean, the pyramids are very striking for being very, as it were, open-minded about animal cognition. criterion of animal cognition, the very first trope of the 10 tropes, is all about, creating a sort of counterpoise to human cognition from the animal case and so on. So that might speak for what you were proposing.
Thank you.